Welcome to the Virtual Server Agent Learning Byte. In this Learning Byte, we will learn about the Virtual Server Agent, how to configure it, and see a short demo. There are several steps required to configure the Virtual Server Agent within the Sympana Administrative Console. Detailed step-by-step guidance is provided in Commvault Books Online, located at http://documentation.commvault.com. This module will take you through the process, focus on key configuration options, and provide best practice guidelines to properly configure the Virtual Server Agent. Please take note that many of the configuration options for this agent are very similar, if not the same, as all other Sympana agents. In order not to be redundant, this Learning Byte will focus only on those configuration options unique to the Virtual Server Agent. Creating the Virtual Server Agent client. Prior to configuring the Virtual Server Agent in the Commvault console, ensure the Virtual Server Agent has been installed on all physical or virtual servers. To create a new virtual client, right-click on Client Computers, select New Client, then Virtualization, then select VMware, vCenter, or Microsoft Hyper-V. Defining the VSA and creating VSA proxies in VMware. For VMware, the Virtual Server Agent credentials must be supplied for access to the VMware vCenter or an ESXi server. A proxy server for VMware must also be selected from the Clients, Client Groups section by selecting the Add option on the screen. Select a VMware proxy host from the Exclude list. The list displays all the clients which have Virtual Server Agent installed and all client groups. One or more clients or client groups can be selected. When a client group is selected, ensure that at least one client in the group has the Virtual Server Agent installed on it. Once this process is complete, the Virtual Server Client will appear in the list of client computers in the Commvault browser. For the Hyper-V client, enter the credentials required to access the Hyper-V server. Select a Hyper-V host from the Exclude list. The list displays all the clients that have the Virtual Server iData Agent installed and all client groups. If you are running a Hyper-V cluster, select all of the nodes in the cluster that will be performing the backup operations. You can set the volume shadow copy to be shared for all VSAs on the cluster shared volume. Once this process is complete, the Virtual Server Client will appear in the list of client computers in the Commvault browser. Creating subclients is key to configuring what data will qualify for data protection. By default, all virtual machines from a vCenter are automatically included in the default subclient of any backup set. This behavior is designed to ensure all virtual machines are backed up. However, when a virtual machine is included in a user-defined subclient, it is automatically excluded from the default subclient. This will avoid duplicate backups of any virtual machine. It is recommended to not modify the content settings for any default subclient in a VMware instance. At least one default subclient must have the capability to serve as a catch-all entity for vCenter data. If you disable this feature for the default subclient, some data in the vCenter may not be protected. If you do not want to automatically include all virtual machines in the default subclient, you can apply a filter for any data that does not require protection. Regular backups should be performed on the default subclient. This will ensure new virtual machines are discovered on a regular basis along with the backup operation. Creating one virtual machine per subclient is not recommended. This creates issues around scheduling and becomes unmanageable in larger environments. To include content in a user-defined subclient, you can browse and manually select virtual machines or any other vCenter objects for backup. You can easily navigate to the required object using the Browse option and select the required content for a subclient. You can select objects such as Data Center, Cluster, Resource Pool, vApp, Folder, etc. When you select a vCenter object, all of its child objects are automatically selected for backup as well. For example, if you select a resource pool, all the virtual machines in the resource pool are automatically selected for backup within that subclient. Just like the VMware client, the number of concurrent virtual machine backups that will be performed for a subclient is determined by the number of data readers. Each data reader will be responsible for backing up one virtual machine. It is recommended that no more than 2 virtual machines be backed up from the same data store at any given time. From the subclient properties, you can filter out specific virtual machines and disks from the backup process. You can also set the filters at the backup set level and allow the filters on each subclient by checking the option to show backup set filters on each subclient. This works much like the Include Global Filters option on other types of subclients. For VMware subclient filters, you can filter virtual machines by VM name or pattern, host, data store, guest OS type, or guest DNS host name. You can filter virtual disks by virtual device node, data store, VMDK name or pattern, or virtual hard disk number. For Hyper-V subclient filters, you can filter virtual machines by VM name or pattern, host, guest OS type, or guest DNS host name. You can filter virtual disks by virtual device node or file name or pattern. Now we will look at VMware Virtual Machine Quiesce options. When performing a backup of a subclient, quiescing is performed automatically for the operating system and applications on all the virtual machines in the subclient. VMware tools are required to quiesce the operating system and the applications. Clearing the option to quiesce guest file system and applications will prevent the process of quiescing during the backup. Now let's look at Hyper-V Virtual Machine VSS options. The Application Consistent Backup option is used when the application such as SQL or Exchange on the server is aware of the snapshot operation in conjunction with the backup. If the VM does not have volume snapshot support, the machine will be placed into a saved state prior to the backup. The option to perform a crash-consistent backup or non-application aware backup is only recommended for non-Windows and legacy window VMs that do not support VSS or have no requirement for application-aware backups such as file system backups. Now we'll talk about some of the advanced subclient options. For the virtual server agent, the number of concurrent virtual machine backups that will be performed for a subclient is determined by the number of data readers. Each data reader will be responsible for backing up one virtual machine. It is recommended that no more than 2 virtual machines be backed up from the same data store at any given time. The number of concurrent backups that can be handled by a data store will be determined by the data store disk performance, virtual machine I/O activity at the time of backup, and the length of time the VM backup will take. Let's take a look at the steps for configuring the virtual server agent for VMware. First, the virtual server agent must be installed on all nodes that will be used as proxies for the virtual server agent backups. In the Commvault console, we're going to right-click on the client computers. select New Client, Virtualization, and VMware vCenter. From the Create VMware vCenter Client screen, we will enter the vCenter server name or, alternately, the name of an ESXi server. For this demonstration, our client name is ESXi. Then we will enter a valid username and password for access to the server. Next, we'll click the Add button next to the section labeled Proxies. And from the Select Client, Client Groups screen, we will highlight the proxies to use and click the Include button. Then we're going to click OK to exit the screen. Once we click OK, the virtual server client is created. Now let's expand the client esxi.company.com. I right-click the default backup set and select All Tasks, New Subclient. From the General tab, we will name the subclient and select a transport mode if we want something other than auto. From the Content tab, we can select specific VMs by browsing or add a rule to have VMs automatically assigned to the subclient by VM name pattern, host data store, guest OS, or DNS hostname. We're going to select the data store option, which will allow us to back up the content of a data store in a single subclient. The Preview button will show a list of available VMs for backup. From the Filters tab, we can select specific VMs to filter out of the backup by VM name pattern, host, data store, guest OS, or DNS hostname. We can also filter out specific disks by device node, by data store affiliation, by VMDK name or pattern, or by hard disk number. We can also set filters at the backup set level and allow or disallow them on each subclient. From the Data Storage Policy tab, we'll select a storage policy and click OK to create the subclient. When the backup schedule window comes up, we can associate the subclient to an existing schedule policy, create a schedule, or select not to schedule the backups. For the virtual server agent for Hyper-V, the virtual server agent must be installed on all Hyper-V servers that will be used for VSA backups. From the Commvault console, we will right-click on Client Computers, select New Client, Virtualization, Microsoft Hyper-V. Then, from the Create Microsoft Hyper-V Client screen, we can enter the client name. This can be the cluster node name in a Hyper-V cluster or any name you choose. Enter a valid username and password for access to the server. Click the Add button next to the section labeled Proxies, and from the Select Client, Client Groups screen, highlight the proxies you wish to use and click the Include button. The Hyper-V servers are used for backup in order from top to bottom, and the first server functions as a VSA backup control server, which allocates which Hyper-V server can back up. Now we'll click OK to exit the screen. Clicking OK once more will create the Virtual Server Agent virtual client. To create a subclient and add content, expand the client Hyper-V cluster. We're going to right-click on the default backup set and select All Tasks, New Subclient. In the General tab, we'll add the name of the subclient, and we have the option to add a description. On the Content tab, you can select specific VMs by browsing or add a rule to have VMs automatically assigned to the subclient by VM name pattern, host, guest OS, or DNS hostname. We're going to select the host option and select Test Hyper-V 1, which will allow us to back up the content residing only on Test Hyper-V 1 in the CSV within a specific subclient. The Preview button will show a list of available VMs for backup. From the Filters tab, you can select specific VMs to filter out of the backup by VM name pattern, host, guest OS, or DNS hostname. You can also filter out specific disks by device node or by virtual disk name or pattern. You can also set filters at the backup set level and allow or disallow them from each subclient. On the Data Storage Policy tab, select a storage policy and click OK to create the subclient. In the Advanced Options tab, you can set the number of data readers. In the Virtual Server Agent, the number of data readers determines the maximum number of concurrent VM backups that will run in a backup job. When the backup schedule window comes up, we can associate the subclient to an existing schedule policy, create a schedule, or select not to schedule backups. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed watching this Learning Byte for Virtual Server Agent. For additional information on Virtual Server Agent, please refer to Commvault Books Online at http://documentation.commvault.com.